Spain's New World fleet approached Tortuga Island with great determination, carrying 80 warships. Commander Adrian de Musquiz had been given the order to completely cleanse the island, and that order had to be carried out without question. There was no other way. This time, it would be permanent. At dawn, when the silhouette of the island emerged through the fog, Commander de Musquiz raised his spyglass and looked. The island was silent, deserted. Like a ghostly land abandoned by humanity itself, heavy with an oppressive gloom. Because the Buccaneers had already retreated deep into the jungle. Women, children, the wounded, all of them had hidden among the steep cliffs inland. But there was one difference. They had retreated without surrendering their weapons. The Spanish forces landed swiftly. They advanced along the shore carefully, yet with determination. They captured Fort Rocher and, along with it, hundreds more pirates. Then they sent them away in chains to the Spanish plantations, into slavery, for as long as they could survive. In other words, they were sent back to the very thing they had escaped from, the same hell. But Spain could never completely cleanse that island. 7 months later, the Buccaneers returned. They always returned. Music begins, deep, threatening, slow. This is not a story of escape. This is the story of how the people Europe threw away. Slaves, fugitives, drifters, criminals, dead-end men built a civilization out of that trash. A terrifying civilization, but still a civilization. And the place where that civilization was built, Tortuga Island, now stands forgotten in one of the poorest corners of the poorest nation in the world. No electricity, no monument, no museum, only those ancient cliffs and the secrets buried within. In 92, when Christopher Columbus set foot on Tortuga, the island was already inhabited. It was not an empty land before Europeans arrived. The Arawak people lived there. Peaceful, organized people with their own systems of agriculture and trade. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the Arawak population was almost completely wiped out. A total destruction. Through disease, through slavery, through systematic extermination. But even then, those people left behind a trace. Do you know the word barbecue? Or where that word comes from? Barbacoa. It was the Arawak's wooden grilling technique, a system they used to slowly cook meat over smoke and low fire. When the French saw this, they called it boucan in their own language, and the man who used the boucan became a Buccaneer. When the word passed into English, it became Buccaneer. Not a dramatic change, but slightly different from its original meaning. And strangely enough, the word used to describe the most famous pirates in history comes from the forgotten legacy of the Caribbean people. Not from gunfire or cannon blasts, but from the smell of smoke and meat. Now we need to understand who those people really were. In the early 1600s, a group of French settlers lived along the western coast of Hispaniola. They were not soldiers. They were not nobles either. These were people who had nothing left in Europe. Runaway servants, ruined debtors, men who had arrived in the New World under false identities. Most of the time, they hunted the wild cattle and pigs the Spanish had abandoned on the island. Alexandre Exquemer, one of them, a man who wrote his memoirs in 1678, described them like this. Open quote, "These men had a smell unique to them, a smell that never left," close quote. Their clothes were made entirely of raw hide, untreated animal skin. Their belts, boots, hats, jackets, all hardened with blood and animal fat. Not exactly civilized. From morning until night, they slaughtered animals, tore out organs, cracked bones open, and drank the hot marrow inside. To keep insects away, they covered their faces in animal grease, and the smell, it never disappeared. Even if they washed themselves, the leather clothing held on to it. These were men who wandered alone like wild animals, carrying their weapons everywhere, asking permission from no one, and questioned by no one. And Spain sent soldiers against them. Why? Because these men threatened Spain's monopoly. The Caribbean belonged to Spain. The Pope had declared it so in 1494. But these mountain men did not recognize the boundaries Spain had imposed. Spanish forces arrived. They burned the settlements. They destroyed the cattle. They wiped out these men's food source. The survivors fled to that small island across from Hispaniola, the turtle-shaped island, the infamous Tortuga. The first sailors who saw Tortuga were met with a silhouette that resembled a turtle, long, low, and green. Covered with mountains like the shell of a turtle, the comparison was fitting. The island stretched 25 miles in length and nearly 5 miles in width. To the north stood cliffs too steep for Spain to land upon. To the south there was only a single natural harbour, Cayona. Dense forests covered the hills and fresh water sources could be found inland. For those forced to run, this island had the potential to become the perfect refuge. And they came. Escaped servants from France arrived. Then came sailors fleeing from England, merchants exiled from the Netherlands, Africans who had escaped slave ships, and people with no known names, no questioned pasts, each arriving with the final chapter of their own story, fled into the embrace of this island, searching for a way to survive. Alexander Exquemelin wrote, open quote, "Tortuga was the common refuge of all enemies of virtue, a kind of school for pirates and thieves," close quote. But the most fascinating part was this. These people, with no state, no army, no law, did not collapse entirely into chaos. They did not simply kill one another until nothing remained. They built a new world, crude, bloody, unjust, but still a structure. And the first rule of that structure was simple. Once you came here, no one asked about your past anymore. English, French, Dutch, it did not matter who you were. There was only one question. Are you... In the mid-1630s, Pierre le Grand walked the shores of Tortuga. Better known as Peter the Great Pierre of the Normans, he had spent months, perhaps years, on the island without gaining anything. He was hungry, broke, his ship was falling apart and his crew had lost all hope. Every possible hardship surrounded him. Something had to change. Then one day he made a decision. With only 28 men, he climbed into a small open boat and sailed toward an adventure with no return. While wandering off Cape Tiburon, southwest of Hispaniola, Pierre spotted a lone vessel separated from Spain's treasure fleet of that year. It was a Spanish flagship, heavily armed, massive and powerful, carrying hundreds of crewmen aboard. Pierre had only 28 starving men, a few pistols, swords, and a plan brilliant enough to sound insane. What happened next would become one of the strangest moments in pirate history. Pierre le Grand ordered holes drilled in the bottom of his own boat. Then he deliberately sank it himself, removing every possibility of retreat for his men. "Take this ship or die. There is no going back." His crew swore an oath. Night fell. In complete silence, Pierre guided the small boat toward the Spanish flagship. The sea was calm, the wind almost non-existent. Slowly, without making a sound, they drifted through the darkness across the water. At that exact moment, the Spanish admiral sat inside his cabin playing cards with his companions, completely unaware that danger was climbing toward him out of the night. Pierre's men scaled the side of the ship. First, they captured the weapons storage, preventing the Spanish crew from reaching their guns. Then they stormed the captain's cabin. The Spanish admiral froze at the table. Not a single shot had been fired. A gigantic Spanish treasure ship, carrying hundreds of tons and defended by hundreds of men, had been captured by 28 starving outcasts. Pierre sailed the ship back to France, took the fortune, and vanished, completely disappeared. Some records claim he later moved to Montreal, but no one can confirm it with certainty. Yet the mark he left behind never disappeared. Because when Tortuga heard the story, the island changed forever. Pierre had shown the people of Tortuga a new path, piracy itself. Within weeks, 2 more massive Spanish silver ships were dragged into Tortuga's harbour by men inspired by his madness, and Pierre le Grand's impossible gamble became an industry. In 1642, a man named John Levasseur arrived in Tortuga. He was an engineer, not a pirate, not a raider. Perhaps one of the most valuable men Tortuga had ever seen up to that point. When he looked at the natural rock formation on the cliffs, his mind filled with ideas. He realized one thing immediately. This place could be turned into a fortress. He carved terraces into the rock and built artillery positions where cannons could be placed for defense. At the highest point, he constructed his own mansion. He brought water into the fortress from a natural spring. Only half of the staircase was carved into the rock. The remaining section could only be reached by wooden ladders, which could be pulled up when necessary. It was a defensive system that was nearly impossible to penetrate from the outside. He named the fortress La Montagne, meaning the mountain. Then he declared himself governor. No one had appointed him. France had never made such a decision. He acted entirely on his own authority. But the Buccaneers of Tortuga thought, "This man built us an unbeatable fortress. He deserves some degree of authority." Levasseur ruled Tortuga for 12 years. Then betrayal emerged. He was stabbed to death by 2 of his own assistants. He had refused to settle a simple dispute, and he paid for it with his life. But the man who came after Levasseur completely changed Tortuga's fate. His name was Bertrand d'Ogeron. He was a French colonial administrator, pragmatic and realistic. Instead of trying to suppress the pirates, he chose to cooperate with them. Every pirate ship that used Tortuga's harbour paid a portion of its captured loot to the island's administration. In return, they received a safe harbour, supplies, and a system where they could trade without being asked any questions. But the most remarkable thing d'Ogeron did was something else entirely. He brought hundreds of women from France. Some were adventurers, while others were women who had no other options left in life. Alexandre Exquemelin and other contemporary sources referred to them as filles de joie, girls of joy. Because d'Ogeron wanted to break the matelotage system. Matelotage was a formal partnership established between 2 male buccaneers. Property was shared, they assumed responsibility for caring for one another, and if one died, the other inherited everything. The system had become so widespread in Tortuga that d'Ogeron believed it was disrupting the island's social order. The women who were brought to the island were married off to buccaneers. Some were even shared between 2 men. Nothing here was clean. Moral boundaries had long since disappeared. Every voyage, a document was signed. This document was called the Articles, essentially the pirate's own constitution. It clearly stated what powers the captain had, how much of the loot each crew member would receive, and perhaps most importantly, how much compensation would be paid to those who were injured. These figures were actually recorded, and the man who documented them was Alexandre Exquemelin. Exquemelin was a surgeon, sailor, and former pirate who lived during the 1600s. Today, he is known for writing one of the most important historical sources we have about pirates. Some of the rules were as follows. A pirate who lost his right arm received 600 pieces of 8. One who lost his left arm received 500 pieces of 8. Right leg, 500 pieces of 8. Left leg, 400 pieces of 8. A pirate who lost an eye or a finger received 100 pieces of 8. And what makes this especially interesting is that this system was actually more advanced than the Royal Navy of the same era. At that time in England, an ordinary sailor who lost his leg in war often received nothing at all. He would spend the rest of his life begging in the streets of London. But in Tortuga, pirates had created a form of workplace injury compensation nearly 100 years before Europe did. Moreover, captains were elected, and for that period this was extraordinarily unusual. The crew could vote to remove a captain if they believed he was behaving unfairly. The distribution of loot was controlled not by the captain, but by the quartermaster, in order to prevent any one person from taking an excessive share. John Locke wrote in 1689 that governments should be based on the consent of the people. The American Declaration of Independence turned that idea into politics in 1776. The French Revolution erupted in 1789. But the pirates of Tortuga were already doing these things in the 1640s. They were writing down rules on paper, signing them, and enforcing them. And that was truly fascinating. Of course, the system was far from perfect. Slavery existed within those rules. There was ruthless violence toward outsiders. Everything was dirty, filled with contradictions. But one fact never changed. People with no institutions, no inheritance, and no support from any state had written their own rules and put them into practice. And that mattered. François l'Olonnais, by his real name, Jean-David Nain. He was born in France sometime around the 1630s. At just 15 years old, his family sent him to Martinique as an indentured servant. He worked on plantations for nearly 10 years. Then he earned his freedom and went to Tortuga. What he wanted was very clear: revenge against the Spanish. The governor of Tortuga gave him a ship. Along with it came a letter of marque, legal authorization to raid Spanish vessels. To him, this was not just an ordinary permit. It was almost an unlimited opportunity. During his early years, he was caught in a massive storm and shipwrecked on the coast of Campeche. Spanish forces wiped out nearly his entire crew. L'Olonnais covered his body with the blood of his companions and lay among the corpses. He remained motionless for hours. The Spanish could not distinguish him from the dead and eventually left the area. He survived. Then he made his way on foot to Campeche. He disguised himself as a Spaniard, freed French prisoners, and escaped under the cover of night. Using a stolen canoe, he returned to Tortuga. While the Spanish were celebrating his death, he had already returned to the city. Afterward, he sent a message to Francisco Orégón y Gascon. From this day forward, I will show no mercy to any Spaniard. It was not merely a threat, it sounded more like a vow. In 1666, L'Olonnais departed Tortuga with 8 ships and approximately 440 men. His target was the Spanish settlements around Lake Maracaibo. At the time, the region was one of Spain's richest commercial centers. The harbor was protected by a fortress armed with 16 cannons. But L'Olonnais did not attack from the front. He advanced overland, from the direction the Spanish least expected. After 3 hours of fighting, he captured the fortress. Then he spent 2 months looting the city. He tortured people. He interrogated prisoners to discover where gold had been hidden. He loaded captives onto ships and demanded ransom payments. The ransom was paid. Yet despite this, he still set the city on fire. In total, he seized approximately 260,000 pieces of 8, along with jewels, silks, silverware, and slaves. When news of this reached Tortuga, hundreds of men volunteered to join his next expedition. His next target was San Pedro Sula, but along the way, his men were ambushed. L'Olonnais captured 2 Spanish prisoners and ordered them to guide him through the region. When one of them claimed he did not know the way, Esquemelin wrote that L'Olonnais killed the man on the spot and turned to the other prisoner, warning that the same fate awaited him as well. L'Olonnais was not exactly a hero in Tortuga, but Tortuga was the place that made him possible. It gave him ships, it gave him men, it gave him a harbor he could always return to. And this was Tortuga's greatest moral contradiction. A society with elected captains, written laws, and a compensation system for injured sailors could still be unbelievably savage toward the outside world. L'Olonnais's end was every bit as horrifying as his life. Near Darien province, his ship ran aground. While moving through the jungles, he was captured by the indigenous Guna people. According to Esquemelin, they tore him apart alive, threw his body into a fire, and scattered his ashes into the wind, so that no trace of him would remain, war or a great defeat. What destroyed it was something else: competition. In 1655, England captured Jamaica from Spain. A new centre emerged, one with larger harbours, deeper waters, and state support, Port Royal. And English pirates began leaving Tortuga in search of better opportunities. Then, in 1670, England and Spain signed the Treaty of Madrid, 1670. According to the treaty, England would stop attacks against Spanish ships. A few signatures on paper fundamentally shook Tortuga's entire economic system, because Tortuga's whole structure depended on piracy. And now, as agreements between Europe's great powers expanded, the space for a small pirate island to survive was becoming smaller and smaller. In 1684, the European powers signed the Truce of Ratisbon, and the end of piracy in the Caribbean officially began to draw near. Some of the people who remained in Tortuga turned to fishing. Others entered the timber trade. Former pirates who had married the women brought from France by Bertrand d'Ogeron became farmers instead. The last major pirate expedition launched from Tortuga took place in 1697. Their target was Cartagena de Indias, present-day Cartagena in Colombia. They returned with enormous loot, but that was the end. So what happened afterward? The region where Tortuga was located, the western side of Hispaniola, gradually became a French colony known as Saint-Domingue. Then in 1791, one of the greatest events in history began, the world's only successful slave revolution. It lasted for 13 years. And in the end, in 1804, the world's first black republic was established, Haiti. The irony was this: the pirates of Tortuga had lived within the system of slavery, profited from it, and helped sustain that order. But roughly a century after they left the island, one of history's greatest revolutions against slavery erupted on the very same land. History sometimes seems to move in strange circles, as if Tortuga's destiny was always to become home to events that seemed impossible. Today, you can still travel to Tortuga, now known by its modern name, Ile de la Tortue. A small ferry carries you from Port de Pikes to the island, but when you arrive, what greets you is not pirate legends, but silence. There is no electrical grid, no monuments, no museums, no restored fortresses or massive tourist centres. An island that once served as a refuge for desperate people now seems almost swallowed by silence itself. The fortress of La Montagne, built by John Levasseur, lies mostly in ruins today. And Cayona Harbour, once crowded with pirate ships, is now home only to small fishing boats. Around 25,000 people struggle to survive in one of the poorest regions of Haiti. But beneath those cliffs, inside those forests, at the bottom of that harbour, the traces of one of history's strangest social experiments still remain. Because Tortuga was never just an island of pirates. It was also the answer to a deeply unsettling question: can people govern themselves? And the frightening part was that the pirates of Tortuga answered that question in their own way, with signed agreements, with elections, with written rules, with their own constitution. And Europe's great powers did everything they could to destroy them. Not only because they were pirates, but because their system worked. Because a society capable of functioning without rigid hierarchy was a dangerous idea to kingdoms and empires. Spain attacked the island 4 times. 4 times it retreated. But in the end, war was not what destroyed Tortuga. What ended it was law, treaties, economic pressure, and time. The quietest yet most effective weapons of civilization. Today, Tortuga is silent. But look carefully at those cliffs. You may still see something there. The remnants of a great experiment that survived for half a century. The legacy of people who escaped the world destroying them and wrote their own rules instead. It was dirty, violent, contradictory. But it was their system. And on a tiny rock in the Caribbean, it truly functioned for nearly 50 years.